So I'm joined today by somebody who I've followed extensively after I read this book called Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, and the Healing of Northern Plains American Indian Boarding School Survivors by Dr. Denise Lajimodiere.
Mm-hmm.
And she is not only a scholar and an educator, but she's also an artist. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lajimodiere. I'm going to call you Denise if that's okay.
Dr. D, Denise is fine.
Dr. D, there you go. So I would just wanted to start by maybe introducing yourself and how you came to the subject of boarding schools.
Yes. Juanin, Wabishkabane, Sawanakwatikwe, Dejanakaz, Shijak Nadodem, Nikanakwaju, Nindunjiba. So my tribal name, several of them at Morningstar and White Thundercloud Woman. My clan is Crane, and I am from the Turtle Mountains in north central North Dakota. So what did you ask now? You asked how I came to do boarding school research?
Yeah.
Yes, I'd interviewed my parents, my father mostly extensively because my mom died when I was fairly young, but I still have a couple of her stories. And I also interviewed my grandfathers. And then when I became a professor, my dissertation, one of the themes that came from my dissertation, I interviewed women, Native women, and their path to leadership. And one of the themes that bubbled up to the top was all of them had been boarding schooled. And so I decided to do a qualitative research interview with boarding school survivors. And I put information in the newspapers, and they volunteered to tell me their story, whether it was a positive story or negative story. But most of the people that contacted me, the survivors, were older. They were 50, 60, 70, and my uncle was in their 90s and my auntie in her 90s. They mostly had some pretty horrific stories to tell. So it's mostly from my mom was sent to Stephan in South Dakota and to Wapton, where she ran away. I just got her records from the archives in Kansas City. My father, though, his story is pretty much more horrific. He was hidden by the parents, the elders that were raising him after his mother died in the 1918 flu epidemic. And they hid him from the Indian agent in Belcourt there. They would tell him to run and go and hide in the bush. But he was threatened. They were threatened, of course, that if they didn't send him, they would take their rations away or throw him in jail. So he ended up being sent to Chemawa, Oregon from North Dakota. 6 of them were sent, along his sister, and 4 others were sent. They were the second group of kids in 1925 to be sent to Chemawa, Oregon. So since then, I've looked into his records and his report card, and he didn't speak a word of English when he got there. So the first 6 months, the part that says the English is blank. Of course, he was beaten for not speaking English. They put lye soap in their mouths for not speaking English. He was nearly killed in something called the gauntlet. He still had the physical scars. Mama also didn't speak a word of English when she was sent to the school in South Dakota, and she was locked in the closet by the nuns and made to kneel on broomsticks until she learned English. So that's what started my interest in wanting to start recording boarding school stories.
And, this is a really difficult topic, and I just want to kind of give listeners a fair warning that some of the things that we're going to be talking about, are traumatic. And we want to handle this with care and respect and, dignity for those who have survived, but those who have, been preyed upon in this particular system. So before we get into kind of the particulars of the boarding school experience, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your methodology, not just in the book, but in the way that you have done oral histories with boarding school survivors and the care and the kind of spiritual kind of aspect of caretaking these particular stories.
I think I had an in because when I went to visit with them, I would go to their home. I wouldn't make them come out to an office. I would travel to South Dakota Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota. I would travel to their homes where they were comfortable. Some of them weren't comfortable in their homes. We went to another room outside their home, or we went even to a restaurant at one time because they didn't want their family to hear the stories that they were telling. So I would offer tobacco, and I also brought gifts. None of that, of course, was funded by the university. They didn't know how to fund something like that, or they couldn't. But anyway, so I would offer gifts and tobacco, but I also would tell them that my parents were boarding school survivors. So I think that helped them become more comfortable with me and helped them to share their stories. So that's it. And then for their emotional help, I would ask them to seek out, if they weren't already in programs of recovery like AA or had sought therapy and grief therapy and PTSD, talk therapy, I would encourage them to do that. Since then, I had stopped interviewing when I interviewed a man from home, and he called me. He talked about sexual abuse, and he said, "I've never told anybody. I'm only telling you that he was sexually molested at Wapton boarding school." And he became suicidal, and that frightened me. And I happened to know the two psychologists, doctoral psychologists on the reservation, and I called one of them and I got him in within like 45 minutes. But I stopped interviewing for a couple of years after that because I am worried about the mental health. In Canada, I went up there and was an international observer for their truth-telling process up there. And there they had psychiatrists, psychologists, medicine people. They had a ceremony. They had paper bags that even the tissues of your tears were put in there and then put into the sacred fire. And even after they left for a week after, they kept mental health people in that community in case there's more triggers. So I have to be real careful if I continue to do more interviews to make sure that the people have follow-up health care and care after they tell their stories.
And just before we get started, are there any resources that you recommend people who are listening to check out?
Well, that's part of the problem. There aren't a whole lot of people trained that, psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors, school counselors that are aware of boarding school trauma. So otherwise, Canada has some, they have a better information source, numbers and places to call where the United States doesn't. I think NABS, Boarding School Healing Coalition, might have a number up also that may be a number to call. Otherwise, they need to seek talk therapy. There's just general therapy for PTSD. So many of them, like I mentioned earlier, said that they didn't want their names put in the book. You'll notice that in the book. And that's because they had to go through hearing themselves, the trauma that they went through, and they didn't want their kids or grandkids to know and have to have that burden on themselves. So many of them only told their husbands. And one man wouldn't be interviewed at all. He said, my boarding school stories will stay right here. And we know that we're off, the saying is we're only as healthy as our secrets. So I think there's so many boarding school people out there that I said in the book, this resounding silence of boarding school survivors. But then Gerald Visner was out to dinner with him a couple of years ago, and he said, where do boarding school survivors tell their stories? When do they tell their stories? Do we sit at Thanksgiving table and go, oh, I was raped by a priest, for 5 years when I was in boarding school. So that really struck me. So a lot of these people, they said, I've never told anybody. I don't know why I'm telling you. And I told them, because I'm asking. So no one's ever sat down and asked, well, they have sat down and asked their parents and grandparents their boarding school stories, but many of them won't talk about it because it's still too traumatizing. So when they relive their stories and tell their stories, they're going into trauma again. And it can put the listener into secondary trauma. So we have to be very careful when we're recording stories. But like the Holocaust survivors, many of them that went through the horrors of the camps are dying. And I believe, their stories all need to be told so that the world never forgets. So what my boarding school survivors said, please tell the world our story. So I think NABS is looking at a way to interview more people, or people can go onto their website and tell their story. I don't want the world to ever forget what happened to my parents and my grandparents.
Mm-hmm. Deb Haaland recently issued a statement at the National Congress of American Indians announcing that her office would do, a federal investigation, or a Department of Interior-led investigation into federally run boarding schools. And the Catholic boarding schools may, we don't really know, but they may fall outside of that scope. And given the kind of the histories that have been written, I know that there was Education for Extinction that was written by David Wallace Adams, which gives a good overview of the kind of the early history of the federal Indian boarding school system. Why did you choose to focus specifically on Catholic boarding schools?
Well, I don't think I did. I didn't focus. It's just, those are the people that called me to interview them. But when I did in my map, the map that's in the back of the book. So what we're still looking at is what denomination ran those boarding schools. But the thing is like Fort Taunton, which is just down the road from me, that's a federal boarding school, but they also had the Grey nuns go in and teach. So there's no separation of church and state. So, so the other denominations, there's also Methodist, Orthodox Friends, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Hicksite Friends, Baptist, Reformed Dutch Church, Congregationalists, Unitarians, and Lutherans. They all ran boarding schools. So like no one had ever asked the Catholic Church, how many boarding schools do you have? So some of the research I did when I was a professor and had the funds, I went to Marquette University and spent 5 days there looking through 35 boxes of their boarding school and day school. So I had to go through each very old records from the 1884 and decide, and it said boarding school or it said day school. So that's the type of research that still needs to be done with all the rest of these schools. The other one that has helped us is the Quakers. That's not on here. So the Quakers actually did their own research for NABS. So they've listed, so we have the Quaker boarding schools. There was a student somewhere on the East Coast that was going to an Episcopalian college out there. And she contacted me and she's given me a list of Episcopalian churches that she's been able to literally dig up through old records again. So we still need more research on more of these churches. And do I have every Catholic church boarding school? No. In the past week, since I put on Twitter and since I put on Facebook, I've had people inboxing me and messaging me about other schools. So since this map of 366 schools, I had found 20 more schools. And now in this past week, 4 more schools that aren't on here. So that's literally Canada knows exactly how many boarding schools I have. And when we sat there with the 3 commissioners at that working supper, Chief Justice Murray turned to me and he said, well, how many boarding schools do you have in the United States? And I'm representing, United States at that moment. Couldn't tell him. So I've made it sort of my life's mission to continue looking for as many boarding schools as I can find. And as you see, just in the last week, there's been 4 more that people have sent me that I go online and vet that, yes, it was a boarding school. And then to note what denomination ran them or if they were federal or not. So on Fort Taunton, there was the federal boarding school that, the nuns came in and worked on that. But just a few miles away in St. Michael's, there was a Catholic boarding school. And these were both on the reservations. And the Catholic boarding school, those kids still weren't allowed to go home for 9 months, even though they could see their home over there. And some ran away and tried to get to their homes. They weren't allowed to go home and parents weren't allowed to visit. So it's not just a Catholic site. I don't think I didn't mean to just focus on them. It's just that those are the people that told me their stories.
Yeah, and in the book, it's quite it's quite compelling to see the sheer magnitude of the boarding school system in each state. You have each state listed by the ones that you have identified, and not only have you identified them, but you also designate which ones are still in operation. And I think there's one on NABS that is a little bit more kind of detailed, not just in operation, but those that still dorm as well.
Yeah, well, this one, like the dark ones are, and I may not have all of them. I thought there was only 54, but I was just listening to Christine speak earlier on another podcast. I think she said 78 are still operating, but those are, like Flandreau is still operating, Wahpeton is, Chemawa is still operating. And then there's a lot of schools in New Mexico and Arizona, but the kids there, they're 100 miles away from school. So they just board for the week and then get to go home. So they're in nowhere near what the schools were like in the 1920s to the 1970s. These are now usually run by the tribe or at least by tribal school boards. So they're not like what's happening here. They need, some of them that are run by the Bureau of Indian Education, like Chemawa, I mean, they just need more funding. Flandreau, Wahpeton, they still need more funding.
Let's talk a little bit about the history of the boarding school system. I mean, in your book, you talk about in 1819 the creation of the Civilization Fund, which allocated money to go to boarding schools. Many of them were run by religious groups. And then in 1874, the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions formed to kind of administer these Catholic-run boarding schools. And then by 1891, I mean, in the midst of that, you have in 1879 the creation of Carlisle, which ran until 1918. But then in 1891, you have this kind of order coming from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that essentially makes it compulsory to go to schools. And if it's not compelling the students themselves, it's compelling the parents and the families by withholding, later on withholding in 1893, in order to withhold rations and withhold treaty annuities. What does this history of the 19th century tell us about the intent of boarding schools and their purpose?
Well, we know from the interviews that the total intent was absolute, complete assimilation. So it was the saying, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And then it was decided that it cost $1 million for every campaign to attempt a genocide, slaughter Native people. So Pratt came up with, I believe in that too, but I rather purport kill the Indian in the man and kill the Indian, save the man. So he liked Indians, but he hated the culture. He wanted them to completely assimilate into white European culture. So and he ran it military style. So he started Carlisle, the first federal off-reservation boarding school. There were a lot of mission schools in the early 1800s that were still on reservations also. But his issue was that, well, they can go right back home every night and keep their language and keep the culture and keep the traditions and the ceremonies. So he wanted them off reservation. So Pratt had a friend, Wilkerson, and he sent him out in 1880 out to Chemawa, Oregon, to start the boarding school there at Forest Grove, and then it moved a few miles south to Chemawa, Oregon, and that's where my father was sent in 1925. So it was harsh military style discipline, and he had to march with a little wooden gun. When he got older, it was with a metal gun. So they had details that they had to do. And they went to school half a day. And then because he became good at math, once he learned English, he became good at math. And even in the Army, he was an Army engineer up in the Aleutian Islands. And so they assigned him to carpentry. So he actually made a living for our family as a carpenter. But my father, to me, was a genius. He was brilliant. He was so smart. What could he have done if he wasn't encouraged to just have a sixth grade education there at Chemawa? Could he have gone on with his best buddy, Dave DeLorme, and gotten a doctorate degree and so on? So, so the schools were only encouraged to do manual labor type things, and the women were only encouraged to work in the kitchens and sew and laundry and knit and embroider, take care of a home. That's only what they were trained to do. So that was Pratt to forced assimilation. And my dad said also he had to choose a church, and he said, we didn't eat. So again, forced Christianity. So Papa lost his language. He never spoke Cree again. My mom never spoke her language again, but my grandmother, who only had a third grade education, my mom's mom, she would talk our tribal language to my mom, and my mom would respond in English. But my dad he never spoke the language again. So my story, my family story, is just hundreds of thousands of Native people stories across the new country.
And at this particular time when, you know, the boarding school system was implemented in the late 19th century, there was also an attempt to enforce things such as allotment and enforce, you know, the kind of reservation order. So even on the reservations themselves, they had the civilization regulations where dancing was banned, where certain spiritual and cultural practices had been banned as well.
Yes.
So not only were the children going through it, the families themselves were also going through it back on the reservation.
Yes, we had our sun dance and our sweat lodge and shake tent. Our spirituality went underground, so they were still being held, but we had to hide it from the priest who would come and smash everything. He would even during Lent he would smash our fiddles so that we couldn't even dance or fiddle during Lent. But yes, our tribal spirituality, Made, we went underground during that area until like 1978.